love that voice, right?
Yeah.
All right, so here we go. Welcome everyone to this overview of timeless learning and a workshop that we're going to be running here in a couple of weeks. My name is Will Richardson. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a co-founder of the Big Questions Institute, and we are thrilled to be partnering with Pam and Ira on this venture. And what we thought that we would do today is have a little bit of a webinar conversation here, about 45 minutes or so, about not just what they plan on diving into in the workshop in a couple of weeks, but also just this topic of timeless learning and how really important it is right now, considering that we're beginning to start to think a little bit about what next year might look like. And certainly everything that we've been through in the last 18 months or so has taught us that we have a lot to think about when it comes to what's happening in the schools right now. So we're looking for this conversation to be pretty lively in terms of the ways in which at least Pam and Ira are working with this topic, and also some friends of theirs from Hopewell City Schools in Virginia. So we have on the call today, aside from Pam Moran and Ira Sokol, which I'm assuming most of you know, we have Melody Hackney, who's the superintendent at Hopewell City Schools. We have Summer Jones, who is an instructional coach there as well, and then Berlin Gregory, who's the director of organizational innovation. And this is going to be a fairly just free-flowing conversation. I've got some questions just to kind of seed the conversation, but certainly it can go in lots of different directions. So if you have questions that you want to offer up, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we can definitely bring them into the conversation at some point. So I'm just going to throw out this kind of meta question to begin with, and it is about this idea of how important it is right now that we begin to think about time and space a little bit differently. So I don't know who'd like to start, but why is it now, do you think, even more important for us to think about the systems and the structures, the way that we configure the school day, the way that we think about the experience that we provide to children in schools? Why is it more important now than ever, maybe, to begin to think about kind of radically disrupting those systems and those structures? So I don't know who wants to take that one.
Well, let me just begin. For a long time, I've described time as the first technology of school and the most abusive. That is the thing we most use to control children and limit what they can learn and what they do. It's, you know, I can go all the way back to the reason we have a definite start time to school instead of kids arriving when they were done with their chores at home, is that the Colt Firearms Company in Connecticut wanted to train Connecticut children to do shift work in their factory. And they wrote a letter to the superintendent of schools in Connecticut to ask that schools start on time. But it's not just the time of the day. It's that we tell children constantly to stop what they're interested in and working on and work on something completely unrelated. We tell them when to eat and when to drink. We tell them when they can go to the bathroom and when they can't. We tell them when their learning starts and when it should stop. And in the same way, we've used spaces in schools all around the world were created for control reasons. That's the whole reason we have the designs that we have. They were not built around the idea of learning. What's happened since February 2020 is that the whole world has learned that time and space should be different. It's become very obvious to everybody except a few employers who are having a real problem hiring people right now. People want flexibility, and they've learned that they can have flexibility and be really good at what they're doing with flexibility over both of those, you know, and control over both of these things. So one of the reasons that we wanted Melody and Summer and Berlin along with us today is they're a school that has really been rethinking the entire school year as a concept on their way to rethinking everything about time. And that's they're doing it in a classically sort of underfunded public school system. Just like I think Pam and I did a lot of changes to time and space in a slightly better funded public school system. So it's possible for every school, and these are changes that don't necessarily require money. They just require the will to do the right thing for children.
Yeah, and I want to kick it to Summer and Berlin and Melody to jump in too, but they really have embarked on some pretty significant changes, and they have not let this pandemic year stand in their way of making some real shifts in time. So Summer, Berlin, Melody, jump in on how are you liberating school culture from traditions and thinking about time differently?
Pam, I would like to say, and I'm going to punt very quickly to Berlin and Summer, but I would like to just jump in on something that Ira said. The pandemic was a blessing in so many ways, and obviously that probably sounds crazy to many of us, but it really was a blessing that so many of the things that we have strategically tried to change over hundreds of years had to change on a dime for us on March 16th. And so we have gained tremendous momentum from that. We were in a change leadership posture 2 to 3 years before, really aggressively 2 to 3 years before that, leading to our balanced calendar, which we can't wait to tell that story on the 29th and 30th. But the pandemic really showed us that we don't really have to overthink change. It happened very naturally and effectively, and I think gave us a tremendous opportunity to build upon where some of our greatest, we call them haters and resistors, were not only forced to change those structures and systems, but they actually found some positive, great outcomes as a result of having to do that. So I'm going to now go to Berlin and Summer to give you a little taste of what we've been doing in Hopewell.
So I think this is a really powerful question, and one that we sit with a lot in schools. One of the things that we ask ourselves very often is, how do we use our time? Time is the most precious resource that we have for our young people. And like Ira kind of talked about, are we spending that doing things that are meaningful for young people? Or are we doing that just rooted in tradition because that's what we've always known? And then one of the things we like to ask ourselves is, like, when we walk through schools, is whose school is this? Does this school belong to young people, or does this school belong to a traditional system? And so another thing that we like to think about is, and this is the most important piece, if we're going to talk about liberating students, we can't talk about liberation and liberating ourselves from systems when our young people don't have a seat at the table. And so we stay rooted and grounded in bringing our students to the table to talk about the things that they enjoy spending their time on. We talk about what works well for them in their learning. What are some of the things they'd like to push on? We include them in all of our instructional design. And Dr. Hackney does such a beautiful job of making sure that our students are at the table as we are talking about these things. And what are the things that we're just doing that are just stupid and need to go? We also are open to hearing that too. I think we have to have honest conversations. And then when we like look at our school spaces, we also, when you talk about like cultural divides and equities, we want our schools to be like a living representation, a living museum of our students' work. We want our students to look in the hallways and see representations from their communities there. We like to invite parents into our spaces. Those are some of the things we'll kind of talk about during the workshop. But those are really the three questions we sit with when we think about this question: is how are we using our time? And the other two that we kind of talked about there. And those are the things that we will share a bit about, like the specifics of what we're doing in the future session.
And as Berlin said, in order to liberate our students, we have to hear from them, bring them to the table, make them visible. So many of our students feel unseen and unheard. And we really feel that student voice is at the heart of everything we do. It's our North Star. So even when we have to pause, and even in a pandemic, we always reflect on what are our students telling us and how can we pivot to meet their needs, not for the future, but in the moment, in everyday student experience. And we do have a quick, I think, video we want to show you, because again, we feel like it's important to put students and elevate their voice even in this session today. And we have captured so many powerful reflections from students over the last 5 years. This video in particular captures our students' thoughts on some of the most challenging things that they faced in the school year, and then some of the most precious things. So I don't know if you want to show that or maybe pivot to something else, Berlin.
No, I think this video is some, if we don't take time to understand our students and ask them tough questions and get tough feedback, then it's really difficult for us to understand where we are. This video was our students sharing some culture data with us. And so I'll just share a quick, share it with you quickly here. And this is hard to see in a lot of ways, but you can't solve things you're unwilling to talk about. I'll leave it with that.
Mhm.
And that's pre us starting some of the work that we've done. And like I said, we have to have and be willing to have tough conversations and listen to our students. Because again, we will never fix things that we're unwilling to talk about, that we're too uncomfortable to talk about.
I have to add to what Berlin said, and Pam and I know we have a video that we might share during the big 2-day session, but where, you know, we listen to students tell us horrible things about what we're doing, you know, but you sat there and you listened and you heard it. Pam and I and about 400 teachers sitting around listening to students tell us what we were not doing in terms of being truly open to diversity and creating opportunity. And That's hard to hear when you've been working for a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades to create that. But if we don't keep listening to it, we'll never know where we are.
I would just jump in and say that one of the areas of focus that I believe, whether it was the work that Ira and I were doing in the school division where we worked, or what the team is leading in Hopewell, is that you can't do that without making yourself vulnerable. And you have to constantly be looking for ways to flatten the hierarchy so you can see, hear from people who are able to point out your blind spots. And I got to tell you that when that starts to happen, all of a sudden you find leaders everywhere in the system, in people who are ready to take on making the changes that are really going to change the game for young people. And that's what we really have been about. It's what Melody, Berlin, and Summer and the folks that they work with are about. And that's where we're going to be going on the 29th and 30th, is into a much more in-depth focus on not just the why, but the how do you do that? And it's not something that happens by chance, as Melody and I've discussed. Will, I'm going to kick it back to you.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting, the use of the word liberating. It's a powerful word, right? And it's one that I think probably makes some people uncomfortable in a lot of ways, because obviously it suggests a real realignment in terms of power and power relationships in schools. So I'm just wondering, I'm sure I find the power question really interesting, right? And so if you're democratizing education for kids, if you're having them at the table, if you're really listening to their voices, I'm just wondering what else happens when you give kids power, other than they have, kind of a they have input and they can articulate what their experiences are. But I wonder, what are the other kinds of either opportunities or tensions that come out of giving kids more power and liberating them, because that's kind of an uncomfortable place for some people to be, I would think.
There's, the first thing that happens, Will, is that kids show you what learning experiences really look like, what real learning experiences look like. They, every place I've seen, when you give the choices to kids, they do things we could never imagine. They're in a different place. They're in a different generation. They see a different world. They understand things differently, and they're not tied to the traditions. Or only a small group of students turn out to be really tied to the traditions, and those are the ones who usually get A's in our schools. So the first thing they do is they show you what they're capable of, across the board. Summer, don't you think that's true?
Definitely. When I think about liberation, I think it's something that continues to evolve. It's like you create that space to hear their voice, and then you empower them with the pathway that they need to go on individually to get what they need. Every student comes to us with a different story, with a personalized need. So we have been exploring this idea of material hope, how what we bring to our teaching and our pedagogy every day is exactly what our students need. And it's not a hope deferred, because so many educators tend to look at our student experience through a lens of deficit. And we in Hopewell, we look through a lens of hope, and we don't teach our students that hope is deferred, but we say hope is now. Hope is right now in your story. We can find spaces to empower you with the tools that you need right now, not just for your future. So many of our students, it's hard for them to think ahead 1 day, 5 days, a year. And we tend to kind of focus on college readiness, which is amazing, but so many of our students are just struggling to survive each day. So what kind of material hope can we give them through deeper learning and equity and relationships and community building? And that's really something we strive to do every single day that we're with our students.
And we also, I think a lot of people in impoverished communities, like Chris Imden talks about this notion of folks only finding hope in fleeing their communities. So we do a lot of projects where we work with young people to invest in our communities and show the difference that you can make right here in your own community. And a way that we hope our students find hope in investing in their own communities, being in their own communities. Like, this is the space that we occupy together, and how can we like be the best humans we can be in this space?
Chris Carlisle and Summer, I love that you guys both spoke to the typical vision statement that many divisions have. And in fact, mine had this for some time, and that is the idea that it's all about college readiness, career readiness, and citizenship readiness. We started saying, hey, that's a low bar. The reality is that when kids start to develop, when they're 4 and 5 years old, a belief that their voice matters, that they can have agency, they can own their own learning. And not only that, but they can influence their own lives, their classroom, their school, their community, even the world. And boy, the examples of that, when you start to unleash the contagious creativity of educators, students, bus drivers, parents, an entire community, you start to get a different kind of work that's going on that's about thriving, not just surviving in school. When I came to your showcase and was able to see the work that kids were doing around what does it mean to be homeless and what are the myths of homelessness, and attacking that as a critical element of work that they were doing, all of a sudden I said, these kids are on fire. And wouldn't it be great to see all of our kids on fire about things that they really care about and that they can influence?
And Pam, I just want to add, I think we've given a number of sort of surface level reactions to when we give kids control and power, and we build their confidence and their agency. But what happens to these children is transformative. And in the end, our goal, and it works, our goal is that they dictate what we give them. They become consumers. They become confident in their expectations of what they deserve and get what they want. And then we move the adults to where those kids are going to take us. And it is absolutely just transformative work, but it truly gives them power is the right word. It doesn't just give them the power to tell us what they need. They then dictate. And we're doing deeper learning with 3-year-olds. We are doing this, making this journey a part of the student experience at the youngest point at which we have the privilege of working with them. When they get to elementary school and middle school and high school, they will accept nothing less. So we've known for a long time, and the sad reality of this, and Ira referred to it earlier, and it just makes me sick, but kids have been telling us this for years. I'm in the end of my career, Pam, from your experience, that we always default to what we as the adults know, and what we're trying to do in Hopewell is say that is never, ever acceptable again. We're going to give kids what they need, and the adults are no longer going to be in charge. The adults are no longer going to be where we build these structures around. They are always going to be, and I know that sounds kind of, trendy language, but it is the standard in this district. And if you don't want to be on that train, we love you unconditionally. Well, actually, we love you conditionally. You're going to have to go somewhere else because that's not negotiable. But anyway,
Melody, it's not trendy. A quote I use a lot is in 1832, a guy named William Alcott, who's America's first grade education writer, said, "We too often prioritize our adult preferences instead of the needs of our children." So it's not trendy. It's been going on since public education came to the United States, this argument. And if we were doing our job, kindergarten would be entirely student driven. Mm-hmm. And every grade after that would be more so, because our kids would be learning how to manage their own learning. When I see a locked down 5th grade classroom, I know the elementary school has failed. Mm-hmm. And that's just, these are the kind of metrics I use.
Yeah. So one of the things that I want to talk about a little bit is that, talking the talk is one thing, walking the walk is a totally different story. And it strikes me that one of the things that Ira and I've been able to do since we both retired is work with, or as somebody, Glenn Robbins, a superintendent in New Jersey, said, Pam, you didn't retire, you just rewired yourself. But the reality is that whether it's in Hopewell or whether it was in our former district, Albemarle, or anywhere else, that the reality is there are steps you can take to really build out and catalyze this kind of change, and to make it a little less painful than many systems make it when they attempt to do whole-scale change. And so one of the things that we really want to be able to talk about in the bigger workshop is a logic model for building out innovation portfolios and creating that sense of a culture of contagious creativity. And I know that Melody and the team that she's worked with has been really doing this similar kind of work of how do you go from a what if leadership, or from a yeah, but leadership model to a what if leadership model? And how do you start to test bed with people the kinds of changes that really you want to make sure we get this right and then move it across the system? And Melody, I was really impressed that you guys are getting ready to, with your what if leadership, to take your crew model from high school and shift it K-12 or PK-12.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Just scaling it, we've had a couple of years to put it in place and see the outcomes. And now we're going to do the exact same thing in all of our schools, including our pre-K program. One of the things that I would just say, and again, we will talk in so much more detail when we on the 29th and 30th. There's a plethora of research about change leadership. And I don't know of any educators that don't, most educators have a heart for children and want to do right by them, as Ira said earlier, and do the right thing for kids. We tend to default to what we know and what is comfortable. And one of the things that we have found, and I have had the privilege of working with Berlin and 2 other districts prior to coming to Hopewell, and wherever we end up, I think we'll probably end up there together. We're in this job together. But one of the things that we have found is that we must be ridiculously cognizant of an appropriate and effective change leadership structure. It doesn't happen by chance, as you said, Pam, and it doesn't happen overnight. And there are times when I have to sit on my hands and just want to scream internally, because we as the adults are so darn slow and resistant, sometimes passively, but resistant to what is not comfortable and feels different. We have found some incredible success in creating our own structures, being patient, while at the same time disrupting and pushing people to get there on behalf of our kids. So just looking forward to sharing some of that on the 29th and 30th as well.
Will, I'm going to kick it back to you. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah. So I have a ton of questions. I don't even know where to start, but I think one thing I'd love to hear more, maybe one more story at least, of what this looks like in a classroom setting. Like, what does it look like when a child really has agency? Because a lot of people are talking about voice and choice these days and about, empowering children, but all too often that's not really a power shift. That's more of kind of just it's a nice phrase that we like to use, and we like to think that maybe, that's moving us in the direction. But, if you, Freire was mentioned in the chat, and certainly John Holt and others, when you really start talking about agency, it really is about a transfer of power, a real transfer of power. And so what does that look like? If you could maybe tell us another story about a child with agency and what that makes possible.
You know,
One of
Will,
my,
one of the stories that Pam and I tell a lot is about, you know, a young man who, as much as we had tried to change middle school, had failed all his classes in sixth grade and came to summer school. And it was in summer school that we practiced what we wanted to get to. So we converted our summer schools to what we call maker camps. And we did no explicit teaching, you know, from any sort of established curriculum. We said to kids, what do you want to make? And whatever they wanted to make, it was our goal to get what they needed curriculum wise into that if we thought that was important. Well, a young man who couldn't pass sixth grade math, given the power to decide what he wanted to do, in 3 weeks created an Arduino controlled laser frame that would tell pitchers where their balls were when they pitched. He later went on to doing many things. The key thing to this is this young man could still not sit in any classroom or follow any teacher's directions. But as I said constantly at that point, that's not his problem. It's our problem now of how to let people take control of things. And when we watched kids given the real choices to make the decisions of when and how, and we saw it whether it was in kindergarten all the way up to a high school we began that had no classes or classrooms. When we did that, what we saw was kids just taking ownership of their lives. To quote one kid, he stopped being educated out of his dreams. And it's, I mean, we could tell a lot of stories, and we will, and I know Melody and Berlin and Summer can tell a lot of stories too. But too often people will hear the individual instead of seeing what happens all around them, the way kids pull in their peers into the things they're working on, the way they push each other, the way they find to collaborate and communicate, the way they go out after the real world, they want to get out of the walls of the schools and do real things. One of the most important things John Holt said was that, you know, he pointed out again that, you know, kids don't see themselves as learning. From the time they're born, they see themselves as doing. And then we tell them when they turn 5, or very often when they turn 3, to stop, and we're going to teach them. And I guess that's what we need to stop doing. Berlin?
We're just trying to figure out what stories to tell. We have so many beautiful ones. I do want to name, like, we're talking about time and space, but I keep thinking about this idea of internal space. Like, what do our students' emotional landscapes look like? Because really it comes down to identity and who they are in a space, right? It's not necessarily just about the environment around them. Yes, we want to create culture and community, but really wherever they go, they take up the space through their identity, their self-worth, their self-awareness. And so this idea of how do we tap into their emotions, the social emotional skills that they desperately want. So many of our students are afraid to really be vulnerable. And so we teach in Crew Academy empathy and equity and just knowing how to show up for each other, even in the toughest of times. And the last thing before I turn things over to Berlin to show some examples, this has been such an emotionally vulnerable year for all of us as adults, right? For the first time, all of us, students, teachers, leaders, everyone has gone through our own sense of brokenness and loss and grief. And so I almost feel that we have to model from here on out. There's a sense of urgency where our students are looking for leaders in education who will model what it means to be vulnerable and broken and show up as who we are inside out, and then like journey through healing together. And so we've kind of shifted from this idea of safe spaces with our students to brave spaces, because we need to know that it's okay to feel uncomfortable. One of our norms is to lean into discomfort. And how do we do that? by really taking our masks off and showing who we are as leaders, as teachers, as students, as parents, and just saying, you know what, it's okay not to be okay. We don't have all the answers. There's no one size fits all, but we are determined and committed that we're going to create as many conditions as possible for deeper learning and equity work.
And so I know we have some thinkers in the room, so I'll share some specific examples. It's hard to share when we have so many, but like one of the things that we all probably noticed during the pandemic is we had some students that we lost to virtual learning. You know, one of the things that we ask students is like, what do you want to build, create, do? We took a few $100 and took a room that wasn't being used at the high school. We tried to reclaim every space that we could find to give it back to kids, and we turned it into a makerspace, right? Hey, you show up to school, we're going to call it 20% time. The first 30 minutes of your day, you tell me what you want to build, what you want to do, and we're going to make that happen. So we gave kids space to do something that was meaningful to them. Another one, specific examples, is we do something called Real Talk. And so I glean all of my wisdom from young people. I don't have to quote very many scholars when I can quote young people like Ajane Pollard. And this is a student of ours who, after the insurrection, really wanted space to talk about what that meant to her. And as she was sharing with some of her teachers and her peers, she hit us with this quote that really resonated with me. If you don't see color, you don't see me. And so as a team, we had to start unpacking that. We had to start talking about what that means about the space that we occupy together, the social justice work that we're claiming that we do. We had to create space to really dive into that work. So I think when you elevate students' voices and you like give them space to share who they are, then you have to honor it and do something with it. And those are just like two examples of, from Ajane's quotes, we started doing some social justice projects and really being thoughtful about that. From the students not wanting to come to school, but wanting to build stuff, we claimed a space in the high school and created a makerspace for them to do work. When we thought about like space and what we want the schools to look like, when we're talking about space, we hired a young lady who needed a job as a high school student and made her our chief curation consultant. So we have a high school student who's going around the high school talking about, yeah, these lockers can come out and let me paint this mural to go here. Or these students are doing some really dope work. Let's figure out a way to like elevate that and figure out how we can curate it so the whole school can see the brilliance that our young people have. So those are just a few examples of the things that we've done.
And I would add this idea of, again, it's a journey, right? So we want our students to be cognizant of just their growth. And we focus on a lot of reflection. I don't know if you can pull up the one of championing the wins, but one of our values is championing the wins. We believe in pausing and having students recognize in each other their growth and the things that they've accomplished with deeper learning and equity. So we invest in leaders, students who are actually literally emailing us saying, I'm hungry for more leadership. Like, what can I do? There were students who emailed us at the end of this year, and they were like, what can I do to get involved? I'm hungry for community. I'm hungry for leadership. So again, it's all about building student capacity, empowering student leaders so they can in return empower other students. And we believe it takes an ecosystem, right, of all of these moving parts to really transform student experience. And again, we are failing forward. I believe someone put that in chat. Robert, I believe you shared that it sounds like a lot of risk taking and failing forward. And yes, we pride ourselves in actually honoring risk-taking, transparency, and just being honest with the journey. It's a messy, beautiful struggle, like
Definitely.
we say.
If you don't want to talk about vulnerability, you don't want to talk about innovation. If you don't want to talk about risk-taking, you don't want to talk about creativity.
Well, and one of the things that we really believe is that equity is plussed up with innovation, and innovation is plussed up with equity. It's really a very visible process of saying that innovation is not for some kids in the work that you're doing or that we've been doing both before we left Albemarle and since then. It's about how do you consistently think about what will occur as a result of this action that's going to put more kids at the table. And as Ira oftentimes says, why would kids come back to school in your school if they didn't have to? And that's what this work is all about, is having kids come to school because they want to be there, not because they have to be there. And when you give kids those kinds of opportunities, whether they're 5 or 8 or 18, all of a sudden you start to see. In fact, we had teachers who would approach us when some of our early work around summer programming and say, oh, we think this kid that's in summer school because they did not do well on state tests is actually gifted. Well, why do you say that? Well, we've never seen a kid before that could design up Arduino cars at age 9. And that just absolutely has caught our attention. She's an engineer. She wasn't seen during the school year. So the more that you do to plus up equity through innovation and innovation through equity, and that's what we really believe, that there's no recipe, but there are certainly some processes that we've both learned that we think help to get there. And so that's where we want to go. Ira, anything else, Will, that you guys want to kick up?
I just had just one quick question. I mean, you know, in our work, we're kind of looking at this. Obviously, we're living in an historic moment right now, and that I don't think that the historic moment is going to end very quickly. I really think that the next 10, 20, 30 years are going to be historic in a lot of different ways, and that this is kind of a hinge moment that we're in, where a lot of things are changing. To us, the urgency is pretty palpable in a lot of different ways. What I'm curious about, though, is that in lots of communities where change happens on a big scale, which it sounds like is happening in Hopewell City, there's resistance to that. And, you know, there's pushback on that. I'm wondering, what's the messaging that you have carried to your communities about why this is so important right now? And how is that landing on people? Maybe where do you get some of the pushback, but then how do you kind of navigate that? And you know, how do you really build capacity in your communities for people to understand the types of changes that you're making? Because what is happening to their kids doesn't look like what probably they did in school, and that makes parents somewhat, like, you know, a little bit nervous about that. So can you talk a little bit about how you go to your community and make the case for a change like this?
I want to say just 2 things, and then we'll pass it to Dr. Hackney if you want it. I think, to your point, one of the things that we realized early on is, in many ways, we're not the ones who should be telling the story. And when we try to go out and speak in that fine education language, and we try to show all these charts and graphs, like, no one wants to hear that. Let's just be honest. There's a time and place for it, but also there's a space where you just need to keep it real. So one of the things that we do is really try to elevate the stories of our students. We give students space to tell their own stories. We give them space to show their own work. A lot of parents don't come back to school because school sucked when they were here and they don't want to come back to it. And so we do exhibitions of learning, which Pam talked about a little bit earlier, where we invite parents in just to have a conversation with young people. Show me what you learned. What did you like about it? What did you struggle with? What do you want to do more of? What were the bright spots? When we have an exhibition of learning, it looks like a block party. Parents show up because they want to hear from their students about their education. They've never had that experience before. Right. So the thing that our team focuses on is how we give students space to elevate and tell their own stories instead of us trying to tell their stories for them.
You know, Berlin, it doesn't matter whether it's urban or rural, because Pam and I were in rural Southern Virginia, and they were doing a showcase of, you know, student developed, student run, you know, student learning projects. And the superintendent said, well, I know I invited you here, maybe 10 parents will show up. Well, what was it, like 600, Pam? They wouldn't fit in the room. And it's the thing of, yes, it brings people back. It brings parents involved. You know, some of you know the story of our middle school kids who built rolling tree houses for their cafeteria. That project brought parents into our buildings for the first time ever, to many of them. And I think it's the thing of, you know, being upfront with people. Pam, I'll let you talk about dealing with, you know, what people see sometimes and how they get nervous about things. And you're muted though.
Yeah, there we go. So one picture that we use that is a very provocative picture image is this one right here. And for those of you that either work in your own shops or you work in schools where you have this kind of equipment, you'll go, so how old is that little man? And I will tell you, he is somewhere between 8 and 9 years old. And then when I ask the question, so what's that tool? And Ira, you always say it's a
chop saw.
Yeah, it's a chop saw. So we put some of our maker work into the community. And this was actually at a firehouse in a small rural area of our county. It can happen anywhere. And so we had people that worked in the fire company, volunteers, teachers, high school students, kind of a real mix of people working with elementary kids. And the elementary kids were working on a variety of projects to help build mathematical thinking skills, problem solving, etc. I was out there one day and I walked up on this little guy and I'm looking at it going, oh my gosh, I don't believe that I'm seeing this little kid on this huge chop saw. So he stopped it. I looked at him and I said, so do you think you might like to have an adult a little closer to you? And he said, I don't know why, I'm the expert around here. And I was like, okay. And I looked around and I saw that there was actually an adult that was within space to keep his eyes on this little guy using a real tool. And then I said to him, so what are you making? He said, well, I'm making a giant Jenga set. I'm going to give it to my kindergarten teacher because I think the kindergartners would really like playing with a giant Jenga set. And I looked at him and went, he's cutting up 2x4s. He indeed is building a giant Jenga set. All the things that we really believe that kids need to be successful, engaged learners in school, to really grab those thinking skills, problem solving skills, communication skills that we would love to see them take with them into life. But you know what else was really incredible about this is that we also saw in this little guy that very explicit strand of empathy development that we think is so critical to building out communities where people actually see the good and the strength in each other, not just look for the deficits. We see this kind of kid as being the kid that will help us save the world. So I'm just going to kick it back to you guys. Thrilled to be here with Melody, Berlin, Melody, Summer, Ira, Will, and all of you in the audience, including some former educators that I know from my system. It's great to see you all here. And
I know, Pam,
we want to take you so much farther on July 29th and 30 into the how do you make this happen? Because we believe every person in this audience, grab a partner, grab a team, come with us. And what we want to do is to actively engage you in the how-to of this and to get you doing the work with us.
And I just want to add to like one thing. I just got to give you an Ira shout out too. Like it's so easy to like step over conferences like this or not have time or find a good reason not to show up. But we really embrace this notion of better together. And a lot of the things that we do in Crew came from Pam and Ira in teams. A lot of the spaces and lockers that we ripped out and things that we really pushed on came from Ira and Pam in Albemarle. And, you know, the best resource you'll ever have is the person sitting next to you. And I would encourage you to, there's a lot of brilliance in this room. Come into this space together, show up, and let's just learn from one another. None of us have right or perfect answers, but together we can do some really incredible things for young people.
Amen.
So I just want to we'll pull this together here. Just a fantastic conversation. Just again, want to remind you that we're going to be running this 4-hour total, 2 hours over 2 days on the 29th and 30th. Please spread the word, because this is going to be a lot of really interesting conversation and learning, no question. And it's like I said, we are here at the Big Questions Institute, HOMA, and I are thrilled that Pam and Ira and friends will be really taking the time to make this understandable and to just kind of peel back the layers on how we can do this, because it's important work right now. There's no question about that. Schools are at a reckoning point, I think. We're going to have to begin to rethink the experience from the ground up. And this is certainly one way to begin to think about it. When you look at not just time and space, but when you look at power relationships, when you look at all of the ways that we interact with children and ways in which we can make their education more just and more relevant, this is certainly a big part of it. So we hope that you will join us. Want to thank you again, Pam and Ira. Thank you so much to Summer and Berlin and Melody for spending some time with us this afternoon. This will be up on the Big Questions Institute YouTube channel, and I'll be tweeting it out if you want to share it with people so they can get a sense of what's coming up as well. And other than that, thanks so much again for joining us, and we look forward hopefully to seeing you in a couple of weeks. Really appreciate it. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you all.